this book. In fact, I think with Revelation, the hardest part of the book is behind us. We still have some strong imagery in chapters 17, 18, and really throughout the rest of the book. But as we get in 17 and 18, especially 18, we're really into a summary type of chapter, and it's not as in-depth. We're simply going back on the imagery that we've talked about throughout this point of the book, and it's not near as difficult to grasp a hold of as what some of these past chapters have been. Before we get started in this chapter, I believe we read through 6 verses last week. Are there any questions or comments before we get into the material? You're quiet, Emily.
Yeah.
No questions. Okay.
Well, I haven't thought yet.
You haven't thought yet, okay.
Get me thinking, and then I'll have questions.
And then they'll come, okay. So as we started last week, we talked about the book of Hosea. We talked about this imagery beginning to play out here in chapter 17, where in this chapter we have the prostitute on top of the beast. And the prostitute here, I believe, is Israel. It is the apostate state of Israel. Those who were supposed to be God's people, but they have prostituted themselves with other nations for, as we'll see in chapter 18, for their own financial good. And furthermore, they have persecuted the very Messiah, the true bride of Christ. It's been a while now, it's been several months, but you may remember that I suggested that really the seals in many ways represent a divorce decree from God to Israel. They've been unfaithful numerous times, continually, and now God is completely divorcing himself from what was his chosen people. And in the next couple of chapters, by the time we get to chapter 20 and 21, we're going to see the new bride, the true bride, if you will, being taken into heaven. And so with that, we have this imagery of the prostitute in chapter 17. Starting in verse 1, "Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came to me and said, 'Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on the earth have become drunk.' And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abomination and impurities of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead was written a great name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of the earth's abominations. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus." Very vivid imagery, is it not? Not necessarily pleasant imagery whatsoever. We talked about this one. We started to talk about some of the description of her last week. And we talked about the fact that she's beautifully arrayed. She has the finest clothes on, and has some of the high-end things of this world. But we emphasized the contrast between her and the great woman of just a couple chapters ago. Is it chapter 14? 15? 15. Nope. 12. Thank you, Shirley. There it is. I need to turn that one more page. The woman of 12 True Israel, who becomes the church, the people of God, is not adorned with beauty of this world. She's adorned with stars in her crown. She's adorned with the moon of her feet and being robed, was it as with the sun? Yeah, clothed with the sun. So she has a spectacular clothing herself, but all of these things are ancestral. They're heavenly. They're beyond this earth. We see Israel at this point have adorned themselves with the things of this world. And certainly we can look into history, we can read our Bibles, and we can see that to be the case. That they, at this point, have become very concerned with the things of this world. They've been admonished not to over and over again. They were told, when you come into this land with houses you did not build, with vineyards you did not plant, with wells you did not dig, don't forget your God. And they have done precisely that. Questions or comments? So the next thing we did note about this woman is verse 3. And he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness. So John is carried by the angel in the spirit. So he's taking a vision, if you will, to where this woman is. And it's in the wilderness. Now, we're noting some of the similarities, but also the contrast between this woman and the woman of chapter 12. Remember that chapter 12, that the dragon was prepared to consume the child, and when he could not, then he pursued the woman of chapter 12, and she went into the wilderness where God had prepared a place for her. You with me on that so far? Mm-hmm. That was not a permanent dwelling place of the people of that woman, of God's people. When you think about the 40 years in the wilderness, what did it represent for Israel? A time of rejoicing?
Punishment.
Punishment. Banishment, if you will. Right? Now, if you think about that, though, it was also a time of protection for the younger generation. God took them into the wilderness, and for the group of people who would not follow his word and go into the promised land, it was punishment. And it became their last dwelling place, their permanent dwelling place, right? The Hebrew writer talks about those whom God was not well pleased with, even though he'd rescued them from Egypt. That younger generation that had not yet become ingrained in their stubbornness of rebellion to God, for them it was a time of protection. Right? God preserved them, and then through Joshua provided them the promised land. I think what we see in these two women is that same contrast. For the woman in chapter 12, God has prepared a place of protection in the wilderness for a short time. Remember, 3.5 years. This woman in chapter 17, we see that John goes out to the wilderness to see her. I believe it's a permanent place of dwelling for her. It's symbolic of God's rejection, that she's outside of the presence of God. Questions or comments?
I have one.
Yes. Oh, we've got you warmed up now.
These younger generation, wouldn't they have been taught by their elders? So wouldn't they be rebellious too?
Well, eventually, I don't know about that generation, but preceding or following generations were. And I didn't know how to describe it other than generations, because it was anyone under 20, right? Anyone over 20 passed away. I think what was is that older generation kept looking back to Egypt, just like Lot's wife, saying, why didn't you leave us in Egypt? At least we had good food there. And they kept rebelling and lashing out towards God. And eventually, when they got to the promised land, it would seem as though that was part of the reason they didn't go in. I mean, the stated reason is we're like grasshoppers in comparison to these people. But if they weren't looking over their shoulder for where else they wanted to be, it would have been easier to prompt them in. Those younger ones, if you will, they got to grow up in the wilderness. They didn't have a home to go back to. Their home was wilderness. I think there's a spiritual lesson there for us. When this world is a good and comfy place and somewhere we desire to be, it's a lot harder to take spiritual steps. Did that answer your question? So this woman in 3 is in the wilderness. Now, we're going to describe this beast a little bit further. Actually, the angel describes her as we go throughout the rest of this chapter. So I won't get into too much of the beast other than in verse 3, we see has 7 heads and 10 horns. We'll talk a little bit more about what those are in particular. But I think broadly speaking, in our imagery, the heads represent intelligence, and horns all throughout the Old Testament represent power. That's what they symbolize. So right off the bat, we can note that this beast is one of great intelligence and extreme or abundant power. The number 7 is complete. Number 10 is abundant in Hebrew tradition. Back to the woman in verse 4, we see her attire, which we've talked about. And in her hand, she is holding the cup, a golden cup. The idea here is as though a drink offering is being offered. I noted one of my cross-references that helps me understand this is Romans chapter 12 and verse 1. In fact, this passage helped me understand what Paul's talking about, I think, as I went back and looked at some of the sacrifices offered by the Israelite people. Paul says in 12 and 1, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto your God, which is your reasonable service. One of the things that they did is they poured these drink offerings out at the end of their sacrifice. I believe that one of the symbolic purposes of this is, and we can think of Jesus to illustrate it well for us, his life was completely poured out for his purpose, for our good. This woman has, as though it's a golden cup, as though it would be a cup like the priest would hold to pour out her offering, but what's her offering full of? Abominations and impurities from her sexual, her fornication or sexual immorality. The wickedness of this world. I think there may be an allusion here too to the kind of worship service that was taking place at this time. Sexual immorality or fornication was something used to worship the god of Diana and others. So it's, I think, symbolizing her wickedness and the fact that what we're saying here, she's prostituted herself, the fact that she's followed after other religions. The implication would be, as we go forward here, she's done this for financial gain. Again, I think the reason, and that's what we're going to see about Israel, the reason that she is a prostitute versus simply a fornicator. She's done this for the things, the gain of this world. Questions or comments? The name is addressed, I think, going forward. In 5, it says on her forehead is written a name of mystery. Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes, and earth's abominations. This mystery is solved for us. The reason it's a mystery is God, until we understand the whole plan of God, how could God call Israel his chosen people, his precious treasure, by these names? Now, all through this book and all through the Old Testament, on the forehead, right, symbolized what was on your mind, who you belonged to, who you followed. So this is what's on her head. Babylon, the great mother of prostitutes. It's a mystery because until the revealed plan of God, that he's going to send the gospel to the Gentiles, it doesn't make sense. But it's not a mystery as in the sense that we can't read the name. It's a mystery in the sense that Paul said several times that he revealed the mystery of God, and God had revealed it through his gospel. Questions or comments? Verse 6 really brings it home to who he's talking about. I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the martyrs of Jesus. I really think this is one of the many passages that ties this book into a time frame. Will there be great persecutions of God's people in the future? Quite possibly. But the greatest that's ever occurred, we read about. And the people whom John was writing to were already in the midst of experiencing this. Remember chapter 5 of this book. The martyrs come out from the throne and say, how long are you going to let this happen? We're going to get an answer to that in chapter 18. Questions or comments? So, verse 6 ends then. When I saw her, I marveled greatly. John is gawking, if you will. Why is he marveling? Is it because of her beauty? Was it because of her attire? Or was it because of her great wickedness? We aren't told really any of those, but that would, all three of them, give him, each on their own, would give them reason to marvel, right? And so this is how the angel responds then, starting in verse 7. But the angel said to me, why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast of the 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. The beast that you saw was and is not and is about to rise from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. And the dwellers on the earth whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world will marvel to see the beast, because it was and is not and is to come. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. There are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. One is, the other has not yet come, and when he does come, he must remain only a little while. As for the beast that was and is not, it is an 8th, but it belongs to the 7, and it goes to destruction. We'll pause here in the middle of this paragraph to analyze this beast a little bit. So some of it is quite easy for us and explained very easily. Some of it takes a little more investigation to figure out. And I think that's indicated in verse 9. He said, this calls for a mind with wisdom. Again, I think this is one of those phrases, and we've seen this throughout throughout this book. If John is writing to these people that says, this is who this beast is, and you're going to have to think about it to figure out who it is. And he's writing about things that aren't going to happen for 2, 3, or 4,000 years later. That to me is a mean trick. I mean, you ever see one of those papers that says, how do you keep a dummy occupied? And down the bottom it says, turn over. You turn it over, it says, how do you keep a dummy occupied? Turn over, right? Christy, how long do you spend on those?
A long time.
I can spend days trying to figure that out. It seems like to me that would be a mean trick by God. He's saying, think about this and you'll figure it out. So the people that were receiving this letter, in my mind, had the ability to figure out who he was talking about. Here's what he says about it. The beast you saw, verse 8, that is carrying her, is not, is about to rise from the bottomless pit. Talk about a riddle. Is not, and will be. But the will be is going to destruction. Well, as he goes on in 10, he says, 9. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. Rome, as we've talked about to this very day, is known as a city of 7 hills, right? And those hills have names. They have temples on 5 of the 7 to this very day. I think that would have rung a bell with these individuals. He's saying it's a city of 7 hills. But furthermore, he says it's not just 7 mountains, it's 7 kings. And the kings help us to understand those who were, those which are not, and those which are to come. 10 says, they are 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. That was the was. 1 is, and the other is not yet to come. There were 7 Caesars. Now, when we think of that word Caesar, we think of emperor, right? Because it's used as a synonym. But Julius is the first Caesar to reign as emperor. In fact, he's the first to change Rome from a republic into an empire. And he's the first of 7 Caesars to follow. We are, if this is 68 AD, we're sitting at the very end of Nero's life. Right? And to follow Nero, after that, the lineage changes. The ones that followed him, in fact, the year that Nero died, I believe, is 68. It's the year of 4 emperors. Each one is assassinated in rapid succession. I also think that this represents not only the Caesar dynasty, but Rome as a whole. And I've mentioned this a few times, but with with Nero's death, Rome is thrown into utter chaos to the point of failing. In fact, it never does fully recover to the prestige it had prior to Nero. They go through 4 emperors in 1 year, each one of them serving their own their own well-being to the demise of Rome, to the point of setting it on fire, having their armies attack Rome itself. And the entire world thought that Rome was done. The historians of that day said she's dead. And then Vespasian, our friend who is on the very edge of taking Jerusalem, he was a mule trader and had raised to the point of general in the Roman army, loved Rome. And he was an incredibly intelligent man. Because he did not come from prestigious backgrounds, he had some what others thought to be lowly jobs throughout his military career. He spent a lot of time in Egypt, northern Africa. And what he figured out is that Rome was a parasitical city. In other words, it didn't produce anything. Right? It had to be fed from elsewhere. So as he's monitoring from afar what's going on in Rome and realizes something has to be done, he sends his armies not to march on Rome, not to destroy the city and the empire he loves, but he choked the food off. Sent armies to Africa and said, send no more food to Rome. By the time he got to Rome, they handed it to him gladly. And he saved the empire. They are also 7, 5 of whom have fallen. Right? That makes Nero number 6. Now, what is interesting is 11. As for the beast that was, so see that heads aren't only that which was, which is not, and which will be, but the beast is. As for the beast that was and is not, it is an 8th, but it belongs to the 7, and it goes to destruction. Now, this is some of the most difficult language in several chapters. Hopefully some of the most difficult language you'll deal with all night. If not, you need to work on your communication at home. I believe, and I've read a lot of theories on this, but I believe that John's focus, and more importantly, God's focus in showing these to John, is what's going to take place for the church in the kingdom of God. He says there's 7 kings, and he talked about what those kings are going to be in enough detail that that Christians are able to know who he's talking about. But he says there's going to be an 8th, but it's going to go on to destruction. I think what the Christians would have heard at that time, when everyone else thought Rome was done for, they would have known there's more to come. But what would have they known about there being more to come? Just that there's more to come and eventually it's going to be destroyed. It would have been very vague. So they have great detail as to what would pertain to the destruction of Jerusalem and how they ought to behave themselves. But what's beyond that, they have almost no detail whatsoever. Questions or comments on that? All right, 12. By the way, that silence can mean either I've got completely or I'm so lost I don't even know what question to ask, Kyle. Yeah, that's right here. So simple answer is Israel is the prostitute, Rome is the beast. 12, and finish in this chapter. And the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour together with the beast. These are of one mind, and they hand over their power and authority to the beast. They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, for he is Lord of lords, King of kings, and those with him are called and chosen and faithful. And the angel said to me, the waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. And the 10 horns that you saw, they are the beasts that will hate the prostitute. They will make her desolate and naked and devour her flesh and burn her with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to carry out the purpose by being of one mind and handing over the royal power to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. And the woman that saw is the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth. Now, before we delve into this, I want to connect two things. Verse 6 says that this city, or this woman, is she who is drunk with the blood of the saints and blood of the martyrs of Jesus. Verse 18 describes her as a great city over dominion of kings and the earth. Now, some object then to this being Jerusalem, because at this time she's not ruling over nations. But she had God's dominion over all these nations. She was to be the spiritual light, the city on a hill, right? And what she's done is she's used it for her own financial gain. After Jerusalem is destroyed, the entire known world goes into depression. For one reason, gold prices absolutely plummet. And chapter 18 is going to talk about that. The merchants are going to mourn over your debt. But what's not going to happen, we see this in chapter 18, is no one's going to come to your aid. Remember in the beginning of the chapter that the prostitute is over these great waters. John says that is all these kings and these nations whom Israel has financially prostituted herself to and is gaining great gain for the things of this world out of it. Now, they're going to turn on her. This beast is going to turn, verse 15, 16. They're going to hate her and they're going to destroy her. It's interesting to me that 16 says they will make her desolate and naked and devour her flesh. That use of the word desolate, it's exactly what was prophesied by Jesus several times concerning Jerusalem. Your house will be returned to you desolate or completely empty. And the last thing I'll point out, unless there's questions, is the 10 horns or 10 kingdoms. At this time, Rome is broke into 10 different regions, of which had kings over them. And the armies that destroyed Jerusalem come out of those 10 regions. They're of one mind because they belong to Rome. And so they, with Rome, work to destroy Jerusalem. Questions or comments? Right. Don't have too much time left. We'll see if we can't cover the first 3 verses here. Starting in chapter 18. After this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was made bright with his glory. And he called out with a mighty voice, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt or cage for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast. For all nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living. So, as I described, I hope that is a summary of what I was trying to say for the previous chapter. That Jerusalem is worried about physical gain, about financial gain. That's what the Pharisees were worried about. You know, Jesus takes control, it's his inheritance. If Rome comes because of Jesus, they're going to take our power, our wealth away from us. It's where their entire concern was. Questions or comments? Got just enough time. We'll do 4 through 8 here and finish there because this becomes relevant for the Christians then. Then I heard another voice from heaven saying, "Come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues. For her sins are heaped high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Pay back as she herself has paid others, and repay her double for her deeds. Mix a double portion for her in the cup she's mixed. As she glorified herself and lived in luxury, so give her a like measure of torment of mourning, since in her heart she says, I sit as a queen, I am no widow, and mourning I shall never see. For this reason her plagues will come in a single day, death and mourning and famine, and she will be burned with fire, for mighty is the Lord God who has judged her." Now we've covered with this a third. There's 3 paragraphs here in this chapter. And ending this paragraph, the people of God are called to come out of her. Come away from her. Remember Jesus' words in Matthew 24 were exactly that. When you see the time is near, flee. Get away. Her sins have been heaped up or they've reached heaven, and she's going to be repaid for those sins. I find it interesting in verse 7, I am no widow, and mourning I shall never see. I read numerous commentators. I did not read any that I think get at this. What we're going to see in the next chapter, chapter 21, a couple chapters from now, is Jesus carrying the bride across the Jordan as a groom would carry the bride through the threshold. Jesus is what in the marriage? Groom. Who did Jerusalem kill? The groom. And what she says, bear in mind, she is on the beast. And what she says is, I am no widow, and mourning, as in sadness, I will never see. She doesn't realize, she doesn't admit, she has slain her own groom. She should have been in great mourning, but she's rejoicing. Judgment is at its end. In chapter 19, we're going to see the rejoicing in heaven. Thank you.